What is evolution? We know that organisms change over time, a very long period of time, in fact. And what we want to do, I think, to understand this is to look at it through the eyes of a young man, Charles Darwin, who lived nearly 200 years ago. We're going to try and see the kinds of problems that he tackled as a young man, the sort of issues that were present in this. The biggest issue, in some ways, was just that the Earth itself and life upon it has a very long history. We can see this if we look at the history of organisms. The very beginning, very simple organisms, moving forward, they get more and more complicated. They're changing over time. New kinds are coming into being. Some of the forms at the beginning, like simple shellfish or worms, are then succeeded by more complicated ones, fish, mammals, birds, and then ultimately us. And the process of understanding evolution, the problem that Darwin himself wanted to face, was what ties this process together? What is the cause of evolution? What kind of scientific understanding can we give for that? A key issue for understanding evolution over time was, what is adaptation? Darwin had been interested in science ever since he was really young. He had a chemistry laboratory in his back garden, and most of all, he was a really keen collector. He had a lot of fossils and minerals in his collection, and during his whole time at school and university, he had a very strong interest in nature, in going out exploring and collecting. As part of this, he became very aware that animals were adapted. They had particular characteristics. Take, for example, this Megatherium. This is an ancient animal, a fossil. It doesn't live anymore. It's a giant ground sloth. It's a relative of the modern sloth, but it lives on the ground, and it's adapted for that. You can see, for example, it has big paws that can grind into the ground. It has teeth that are specially adapted for eating the food it does. These are characteristics of the animal. There are particular ways that it fits in to the settings that it needs. And you can see that in terms of the specifics of what Darwin himself saw. And so Darwin, when he was on the Beagle voyage, was incredibly excited to be able to have the opportunity to dig up some real specimens, some real fossil specimens of this extraordinary creature that had lived in the past. And some of the parts he found were of great interest to scientists back at home. How are characteristics passed on? Darwin studied this issue through looking at pigeons. When you go out into the park, you can see a huge array of different kinds of pigeons. Some of them are gray, some are more bluish color, other ones are brown or white. Darwin was fascinated by these differences, and in fact, a much wider array of pigeons that existed because he had talked to pigeon breeders. The breeders had developed pigeons like this one, a blue pouter, who had a big pouch up at the front that you could, if you kind of scratched its neck, it would actually puff up in an amazing way. Or there was this black carrier, which was much bigger than regular pigeons and had a very strange beak. And then finally, his favorite pigeon, the almond tumbler. The almond tumbler had a very tiny beak, a beautiful line here, and then, of course, this lovely brown color, the almond color. Darwin really wanted to understand how these pigeons, these very different pigeons, which you'd think were actually different animals if you saw them, were actually all pigeons. And to understand this, he needed to understand how characteristics were inherited. What Darwin realized was that these pigeons had been the result of the mother pigeons and father pigeons passing on their characteristics to younger pigeons. So pigeons that had a particularly tiny beaks, particularly beautiful color like this, had then passed those on to the next generation. And that generation could then be selected from again and produce individuals which had even more characteristics in that direction. when he returned from the Beagle voyage, he was aware of the key issues that needed to be understood in developing an understanding of evolution. He knew that there was a fossil record extending deep into the past, with many strange and very different sorts of creatures living in very different sorts of circumstances. He knew that animals and plants had characteristics that made them different from one another, and that these characteristics were actually helped them to be adapted to the circumstances in which they lived. And he was aware that these characteristics could be inherited from the parents to the children, and that children differed from one another, so that you got a huge variety in terms of the way that any individual family of organisms looked. All of this meant that Darwin was in a really good position to tackle the question about what a theory of evolution would look like. And in London, he kept a series of notebooks, and in this one, he came up with the crucial idea that he's known for today. What he realized was that these very special inherited characteristics meant that some individuals were better adapted for the circumstances in which they lived. Take, for example, a hawk. Some hawks have very slightly better vision, and that means they're able to catch their prey more quickly and see it better. Or maybe they're able to have talons that are slightly sharper, and so they can grasp their prey. In other words, some of those are going to be more successful, and those ones that are successful are going to be able to have children and pass those characteristics on to the next generation. And that next generation is more likely to have sharper eyes, better talons, and to catch more prey. And those are the ones that are going to survive. Darwin realized that this process, multiplied over the huge history of the fossil record, meant that you could have evolution. You would have a huge variety of new animals and plants coming into being. Here, in the Darwin Papers in Cambridge University Library, we can see how Darwin developed his great idea in the 20 years after he came up with it in London. We can see that he read a huge number of books. This is Darwin's own library, with all his pencil markings and thoughts about how he could use ideas to help to make his theory better and stronger. And it was in this book, On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, that we can see Darwin's theories coming together and being announced to the public for the first time. Now they could be debated and discussed by people all over the world.